Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the McCain Institute's second event in our series called Defending American Democracy. This event is called When Local Elections Are Threatened, What are the National Implications? And we've got a great panel for you today. Before I introduce our panel, I just want to take a moment. We are the McCain Institute carrying on the legacy of Senator John McCain, and I'd be remiss if I didn't pause here for a moment and speak about Ukraine. As many of us know, Ukraine is a democracy, is a country that Senator McCain stood up fiercely, advocated for. And so our hearts go out to Ukrainians as they struggle, as they defend democracy, as all of us are watching and supporting their efforts. We at the McCain Institute are steadfastly supportive of their efforts. Which brings us back to our own country. As democracy is under threat, as we're seeing in Ukraine, in many parts of our own country, we feel similarly as our democracy has been threatened since 2016, when the Russians, interfered in our elections. Our 20 were under massive stress due to COVID and coronavirus. And the people on the screen, are defenders of democracy. They work with people every single day who are at the front lines running our elections, which, our local elections, our local election officials are the front line for our democracy. So this is a great discussion today. We're looking forward to this discussion to talk about how local elections, local elected officials, state officials really impact the national environment for democracy. So I'm really excited about this panel today. Let me start off by introducing our moderator, David Becker. He's the executive director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. He's a longtime elections expert, having worked at the Department of Justice. Second, we have Jocelyn Benson. She's the Secretary of State of Michigan. Thank you, Jocelyn, for joining us. Second, we have Bill Gates, chairman of the Board of Supervisors for Maricopa County in Arizona, one of the largest counties in the United States. And finally, Brian Corley, supervisor of elections in Pasco County, Florida. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today, and we're really looking forward to this discussion. Again, thank you to the Knight Foundation for starting us off and funding this series. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to David to start our discussion off.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thanks to you and the McCain Institute for all of the work that you do in this space and in other areas. And I also want to thank you for mentioning Ukraine at the beginning. I know it's on a lot of our minds, and there we're seeing Ukrainians expressing such courage at great risk to themselves to preserve their democracy. We're fortunate in that we don't have to muster the same level of courage quite that Ukrainians are, and we're not experiencing physical attacks. But I do think there's a connection between the worldwide attacks by autocracies seeking to weaken democracies and the will of voters to govern themselves. As Paul mentioned, I'm David Becker. I run the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research in Washington, D.C. We work with election officials all over the country. You can look at our website at electioninnovation.org. We've also founded the Election Official Legal Defense Network to address many of the threats and harassment that we're going to talk about today with regard to election officials. And the three people on the panel have all been very key in that effort. And you can find more information there at eoldn.org. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is an unprecedented attack on American democracy. The election officials of this country, of both parties throughout the country, did an amazingly heroic job of facilitating our democracy. We saw the highest turnout that the United States has ever seen in a presidential election or any election by every measure, more than 20 million more votes than we've ever seen in any American election, and 67% of all eligible voters voting in the 2020 election, which is the highest percentage turnout that we've seen since universal suffrage a century ago. That's really remarkable. And the fact that election officials managed all this when they were under-resourced in the middle of a global pandemic is one of the great success stories of American democracy. Unfortunately, perhaps because of that success and because of an undermining of our elections and our democratic process by the losing presidential candidate. We have seen unprecedented attacks on the civil servants, on the public servants, both parties who run elections in this country. And as someone who's worked with these people across the political spectrum for many, many years, it saddens me greatly. I've heard personal stories, you're going to hear some of them today, about those attacks and how attacks on that infrastructure weaken American democracy and actually make American elections less secure. We just had the most secure, transparent, and verified election in American history, with more paper ballots than ever before, more audits of those paper ballots than ever before, more pre-election litigation clarifying the rules, and more post-election litigation confirming the results. And yet these election officials still find themselves under attack. The three, I'm going to go through each and ask several questions, and then we'll take some questions from viewers as well. These three all represent different jurisdictions, different states, different levels of election administration, different parties, and their states went for different candidates in the presidential election, and yet all three ran exceptional elections. I'm proud to work with all of them. Secretary Benson, let's start with you. Secretary Benson and I have known each other for a long time, and she literally wrote the book on secretaries of state. She wrote it about a decade ago, and became the Secretary of State of Michigan as a result of the 2018 election, and oversaw every election since. And Jocelyn, if I can, you have a particularly, I think, unique perspective on the role of secretaries of state, especially elected secretaries of state in those states where they oversee elections. And I was wondering if you could just kind of talk a little bit about how you see that role and how that role is changing and evolving, both in good ways and bad ways, given the current circumstances.
I'm happy to, and thank you, David, for that really kind introduction. And indeed, we've been working together for close to 2 decades now, I believe, and it really underscores how a lot of us are dedicated to the work of defending democracy and making it work for everyone, making elections work for everyone. And we are in a heightened moment where the attacks that have brewed in many ways for years are coming to fruition. As election administrators, we are living through this history, these attacks in real time, to the point where in any given moment, I can say with confidence that democracy will prevail if citizens on both sides of the aisle and people of integrity make defending democracy the most important issue of our moment. But it also could very easily wither on the vine as well if we neglect to do the work that is needed to defend and protect it right now. So, with that, this conversation couldn't be more timely. It's critical that these conversations be nonpartisan and be bipartisan, and, reflecting on the role of the Secretary of State, as well as any local election administrator that applies there as well. These individuals are best and most effective at protecting democracy when they're able to be truly nonpartisan, simply doing the work of making sure, no matter where someone lives or who they vote for, or what the outcome of the election may be, that it's protected and accurate and secure. That's really the work that I signed up to do. And when I ran for this office, and what I've seen really in the past 20 years, when these roles were first propelled into the public eye in the 2000 election cycle with Katherine Harris in Florida interfering with the recount process, is that there are administrative decisions that secretaries of state make in their states where they oversee elections every day that can impact whether or not any voter at any time is able to access their vote in a convenient way, in a secure way, in a way that is unencumbered by unnecessary hindrances or potentially unconstitutional barriers. But in recent years, not only have we seen more partisanship injected into these positions, to the point now where we see individuals who were and have been deemed election deniers running to serve as the chief election officers in many states like my own in future elections. But we also have increasing scrutiny on everything that we do. And that scrutiny has manifested itself in misinformation, lies, and then as a next extension of that, threats against our lives and our livelihood. And I know we're going to talk more about that today. But I think the bottom line is that voters have an opportunity in every state to hold accountable and to support election administrators who are doing the work of protecting their voice and their vote. And voters also have the power and opportunity to reject those who would use these positions to further political or partisan agendas. And that's really what the moment is and what the moment requires for voters in our country and for the individuals who are considering appointing these administrators at the state or local level. So I know we'll talk more about that today and the real work ahead. And I'm grateful to be here with all of you professional election defenders in this critical moment.
Thank you so much, Secretary Benson. Something that just struck me about something that you said, it is not unusual that people of one party certify elections where a candidate from the other party won. That's entirely normal in American history. It happens all the time. It even happens at the level of the vice presidency, where you saw Vice President Biden in 2017 preside over the joint session of Congress to elect Donald Trump in an election that he did win and won with a majority of votes in states that comprised a majority of the Electoral College. And where you saw Vice President Mike Pence do the same thing in January of 2021. And Bill, as we go over to you in Arizona, this is something I know you've seen quite a bit as well. And Arizona was in a kind of a unique position in the sense that it had a long experience led by bipartisan coalitions, maybe even more Republican, with mail voting. There was a lot of mail voting, a tradition of mail voting that Arizonans had really relied upon. The systems in place were largely the same in 2020 as they were in 2016. You and other election officials throughout the state had done a remarkably good job with that. But you also had a challenge in the sense that your office, your board, was taking on additional responsibilities with regard to the election going into this, and then COVID hit, which made things even more challenging. And then, of course, famously, Arizona saw a pretty coordinated, comprehensive effort at election denial centered on your county. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in preparing an election with integrity, as you did in Maricopa County, one of the largest counties in the country? I don't know if people realize this, but I think it's over 60% of all Arizonans reside in your county. And kind of your experience with the attacks on election integrity post-election.
Yeah, no, well, David, thanks so much. And I really want to thank the McCain Institute for inviting me. As an elected official in Arizona for 12 years, I spent a lot of time with John McCain. And I got to tell you, that's one of the things I've thought about a lot in the last 2 years is, what would John McCain say? What advice would John McCain have given me and my colleagues as we've dealt with this? So again, I'm just honored to be a part of this and honored to join other elections officials from across the country. But for me, serving as an elections official is frankly is a part of my job. We have a broad portfolio. We have a budget of $3 billion. We handle transportation issues, air quality, so many things. But the focus for the last 14 to 16 months for the rest of the world has been that we do elections. And obviously we've put a lot of time into that. But yeah, David, you asked about the election structure. So for about 50 years, our elected county recorder had all of the elections responsibilities for Maricopa County. And as you pointed out, we're a large county, fourth largest county in the country, 4.5 million residents. And it became obvious to those of us on the Board of Supervisors that to have all of this responsibility focused in one partisan elected official was problematic. So we stepped up back in 2019. I was actually chair back then, and sat down with then Democrat recorder Adrian Fontes and said, Adrian, we need to work out a new election structure, a new election framework moving forward, where the 5 elected officials on the Board of Supervisors and the recorder can work together. At that time, 4 Republicans and 2 Democrats to create a new election structure. And it wasn't easy, but we worked it out. And essentially, the breakdown was early voting and voter registration is the recorder's responsible for that. And the Board of Supervisors is responsible for election day voting and tabulation. And you're right, David, mail-in voting has a long history in Arizona. In fact, in 2020, almost 90% of the votes in Maricopa County were mail-in. So we do have a different experience than many other states. And, you know, I'm really proud of how elections officials around the country, particularly the Republican ones, stood up to a lot of pressure in states like ours, in counties like ours, where Joe Biden did get the most votes and went ahead and certified the election. And there was a lot of pressure. But honestly, there was nothing. It was nothing compared to the pressure that we have experienced on the Board of Supervisors since certification in November of 2020. And you referenced a little bit of that, but just to hit the highlights of it, death threats, like unfortunately many other elections officials have heard many, you know, chilling phone calls, social media on a daily basis. We had orange jumpsuits. One night I went on air in Burnett, and that morning we had orange jumpsuits mailed to the 6 of us, the recorder and the 5 members of the Board of Supervisors. So again, this constant drumbeat that we are somehow complicit in a criminal enterprise to throw this election to Joe Biden. And in fact, we have been investigated now for several months by the Attorney General, Republican Attorney General Mark Brnovich. The reason he is doing this in criminal investigation is because the president of our state Senate, Karen Fan, sent the Cyber Ninja report to him and asked that he do a criminal investigation. We continue to deal with that criminal investigation on a daily basis. One of my colleagues, Clint Hickman, who also is a very successful egg company with a lot of chickens. You may have seen some things sent out by the Gateway Pundit where they claim that Clint Hickman, and I'm not making this up, fed the ballots to his chickens and then set the farm on fire. These are and that story was just reposted on my Facebook yesterday by someone I went to high school with. So that's what we're dealing with. And she didn't post it there as a joke. The threats have come to Maricopa County itself. The Attorney General threatened to take over $700 million in state shared revenues away from Maricopa County, which would have put us out of business because we refused to turn over routers at the request of President Trump because he wanted the routers. These routers had sensitive information that would have put law enforcement operations in peril. We pushed back, but in the end, we had to work out a settlement to avoid that. Then just in the last couple of weeks, the Arizona House has passed out of committee a bill to split us up into 4 counties. The attacks continue. My colleagues and I are literally called traitors on a daily basis. And now I have great concerns about the future. We now have one of the leading candidates for Secretary of State on the Republican side this year in 2022 is none other than Mark Fincham, who was at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th and has made it very clear what his intent will be if he is elected Secretary of State. I was honored to go and testify with you, David, in front of the House Oversight Committee to tell our story of the good election that our election workers ran. And now on a daily basis, there are posts on social media that I, quote, lied in front of Congress and that I should be prosecuted for lying in front of Congress. Obviously, no basis for that at all. Additionally, 4 of the members of the Board of Supervisors faced a recall effort. Fortunately, that was not successful. And additionally, one of our colleagues was forced to resign after he was recorded making comments about the Maricopa County audit. So, these are just a few examples of what we've dealt with. But here's the amazing thing to me. Through all of this, none of the employees working in the Maricopa County Elections Department, headed by the recorder and the Board of Supervisors, have left. They've all stayed, and they're excited to work on the 2022 election. So I tip my cap to them. These people have dealt with so much more. Again, this is just one part of my job, but for them, this is what they do every single day, all day long. And I'm proud of all those people.
Thank you so much, Bill. I mean, I don't, you've just heard, they've bifurcated responsibility. So for transparency, for credibility between a majority Republican Board of Supervisors and at that time a Democratic recorder. That Democratic recorder, they all ran a great election together. That Democratic recorder happened to lose the same election, by the way, to a Republican. And Republicans in Arizona, in Florida, in Michigan, as we all know, did very well down ballot. This was largely concentrated on a single race, the presidency, where clearly voters had a different impression about the candidacies. I also just want to say, Bill, it's been a while, and I hope this will change soon, but I've had the privilege of touring the Maricopa County operation. Maricopa is not only one of the largest counties in the country, it is one of the more challenging counties in the country to run elections because it has a huge number of people, but it's also highly mobile, people moving in and out of Maricopa County all the time. We were just talking about this before the session. This is true of other similar counties like Clark County, Nevada, and Los Angeles County, California. And election officials will tell you that mobility makes things really challenging for them because every new person who moves in might be a voter who needs to be registered, and every voter who moves out, you want to get that information to keep that voter record up to date so that you don't accidentally have them on the rolls. Arizona does a remarkably good job of that, thanks to county election officials like yourself. And then moving on to Florida, where Brian, you and I have also known each other for a long time. You're an elected Republican supervisor in a county, Pasco County near Tampa. You have been as professional an election official as I've known. I'm often in awe of the fact that Florida in 2000 was an international punchline about elections. And in 2020, it was an international model for running elections. And I said this before the election, and many people didn't believe me when I said it, but it turned out to be true. And it's thanks to the professionalism of the supervisors of election, primarily in the 67 counties. Do I have that right, Brian? 67 counties in Florida, the majority of whom are Republican, and who've really banded together to build a culture of professionalism, thanks to people like Brian. And in a state like Florida, Brian, you're always going to be under scrutiny. You're always going to have national press looking at your election. You saw the highest turnout in Florida history in your election. You had people using easily accessible mail voting, early voting, in-person voting in Florida, as you always do. And President Trump won by the largest margin of a statewide candidate in quite some time, with all of the security integrity measures. Can you talk a little bit about those security integrity measures? Because you, in particular, as a county election official who's done this for so long, you know the nuts and bolts. You get down into the weeds in a way that few of us ever see.
Yes, thank you, David, for those kind words, and thank you to the McCain Institute for having me. It's truly an honor to be here with my my colleagues, Chairman Gates and Secretary Benson. And let me just say this: you hit the nail on the head. It doesn't matter if you're one of the 67 in Florida or if you're in Michigan, Arizona, or anywhere in between. Election administrators are professionals. We are made up of varied races, genders, ethnicities, backgrounds, political persuasions, of course. But at the end of the day, we're politically neutral, agnostic, and professionals. And to see our profession and those who are in the trenches of democracy being called traitors and treasonous is just unacceptable. And it's very, very disappointing. 2020 was like no other election. To think that we collectively were able to pull off an election, highest turnout during a pandemic. I made the joke in 2020 that I was at a point where if aliens had landed on a major interstate, my first thought would have been, are they socially distanced? Are they wearing a mask? We were able to pull off the election. Like you said, most secure, most transparent, most number of audits, most number of paper ballots. A simple thank you would have been sufficient. Instead, we face being vilified and threats and whatnot. And that's just so sad. With regards to what we do for being accessible and integrity, has to be a balancing act. Obviously, I think it's safe to say all of us have one agenda as election administrators. Very simple. We want 100% of those that are eligible registering to vote, and 100% of those who are registered voting. The rest should be between the candidates and the good Lord above. It's a personal pet peeve of mine, and we've seen it. It's nothing a new phenomenon, but it's been amplified by a gazillion when we're seeing partisan politics hijack election administration. That should be left up to the candidates and the parties, not those of us that are administering elections. But with integrity, a few things comes to mind. It's like the election never ended for 2020. We have a lot of activist groups, which is not a bad thing, asking questions. That's a good thing. But when they're not familiar with the laws, the processes, the procedures that are in place, like we get asked all the time, our voter rolls are voter rolls. Well, we do what's called list maintenance every day. Literally every single day, we are removing people from the rolls. So it's an ongoing, daily, hourly activity, dare I say. And with integrity, we've seen recently, and this is a great example of the misinformation that's been sown with regards to ERIC, or the Electronic Registration Information Center. We personally lobbied. We as election supervisors lobbied Florida to join ERIC and be one of the 31 states. And now we are able to see that there are some folks who decided to vote in Florida and another state. It's in the category of de minimis, but obviously one's too many. And now we're able to work with law enforcement. So ERIC has allowed us to also reach out to those that are eligible and unregistered and identify those who shouldn't be on the rolls or clean up our voter rolls. So it's a great balancing act. So again, having that balancing act of access and integrity is a necessity, but that's what we all do. It's a no-brainer.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I mean, I'm struck by your stories, and obviously I've heard much of it before because I get to talk to you and many others like you. I mean, we have 3 states represented here: Michigan, Arizona, and Florida, and the margins and victors were different in these states. In Michigan, Biden won an election that wasn't particularly close, but I think approximately 154,000 votes, if I'm not mistaken. In Arizona, it was very close. It was just over 10,000 votes. That's still, as people will tell you who work in the elections business, in the realm of recounts and audits, that's a landslide. But it does seem close when you look at a statewide election. And in Florida, President Trump won by hundreds of thousands of votes. And yet, what I hear talking to election officials all over the country is that the margins aren't even mattering anymore. Brian, you're seeing as much abuse as county election officials in other states. I've talked to election officials in California and in Texas and in North Carolina and other places where the results were different, some of which Trump won, some of which he lost. But we're seeing a tremendous problem. Another thing you all have in common in your states is voters find it really easy to vote in your states. The opportunities to vote are there. You've all worked hard to make sure that that's true. It would be very difficult to find a voter in Michigan, Arizona, or Florida who were eligible and had difficulty casting a ballot that would count. And one other point, and Brian, you mentioned this with regard to list maintenance. You all have done a remarkable job at the state and local level to make sure your voter lists are accurate. Everyone wants as many eligible voters on the list as possible, but they want people who aren't eligible because they've moved away or something, or they've died, off the list. That makes a lot of sense. And you've all worked, all of your states joined ERIC, all of your states conduct regular list maintenance. And I think it's safe to say, working as much around the country as I do, all of your voter lists right now are as accurate as they've ever been, and they'll probably continue getting more and more accurate over time, even as people move so much all over the country, which is one of the big challenges. One of the other things I hear when I talk to election officials is one of the things that's really remarkable is how strong the election official community is. There are people across the political spectrum who come into this work, often by accident, and find a community and a sense of civic duty. And they just feel that duty so strongly. As I've spoken to people, they feel that sense of civic duty eroding and under attack. I can tell you, I've talked to election officials where, and I'm not making this up, literally election officials have cried at times when I've spoken and asked to give me a hug, which is not a normal thing that happens at my speeches. But there's a weariness, and Bill, I think you spoke to it as well, that's really troubling. Jocelyn, if I can start with you, can you guys each talk a little bit about your stories? Jocelyn, if it's okay. I mean, I remember very vividly being on the phone with you in November, and we were talking about some matter of election procedure as you guys were doing it, and you said, I have to get off the phone, my house is under siege. And You weren't the only one. I remember that very, very vividly. But I know you've seen that personally, and you've seen election officials around your state experience that, people in both parties. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you have local city clerks calling you, as they have me, and saying, someone showed up to my house today with a gun. What do I do? Someone showed up to me when I was at my kid's school and said, I hope you get COVID. And I mean, there was a number of different ways that this anger about the results of a legitimate presidential election has manifested itself, really, spurned by partisan officials who have made threats themselves, as the former president made threats directly against me. Then many of their supporters then try to, live out those threats. And I think for me, it's really heartbreaking because on, two fronts. One, many of these individuals have been lied to by people they trust, and they believe lies, and they've been deceived. And in furtherance of those lies, in furtherance of a belief that something has been stolen or taken away from them, or something wrong has happened, they're trying to seek justice and feel, very much in the right in doing that. And the foundation of that, though, is based on a lie, when in reality, we've had the most successful election in Michigan's history in 2020, with more people voting than ever before, and including, so many voting from home for the first time. So it's always just heartbreaking that this is the moment that we're in. And then secondly, that night that is now, well known, where people showed up at my home and were, threatening my family and shouting into bullhorns. That moment for me, and David, I know you know this, I started my career in Montgomery, Alabama, investigating hate groups and hate crimes around the country. And it was really being on the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma that inspired me to commit my life to doing whatever I could in every moment to continue the work of those brave men and women who stood on the foot of a bridge, faced down state troopers, and stood to support everyone's right to vote. So I thought of that in that moment, and I remember that, and that's why I have pictures of the Edmund Pettus Bridge all throughout my office and home, because in many ways the foot of that bridge today is being stood on by election administrators all around the country. And as we face threats, I recognize that these threats aren't necessarily against us as individuals. They're against democracy. They're against the voters. They're against a fair and free election that was an accurate reflection of the will of the people. And it's an attempt to undermine that, to through intimidating and attacking us, dismantle democracy. So, knowing that, I have only been emboldened by these threats, and I know many of us have as well, because no one's going to intimidate me out of doing the job that the people of Michigan elected me to do, and protect every citizen's right to vote. Yet at the same time, as we've all talked about, it's been very grueling and a sad, heartbreaking part of the work we now must do in this moment with the increasing threats to democracy all across our country and our world.
Yeah, I mean, I'll you're too humble to mention this, but Jocelyn, actually, this civic religion that we all share of American democracy, and certainly the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma is one of its sacred sites. And Jocelyn actually organized the secretaries of state from around the country to join arm in arm, walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Republicans, Democrats together from all over the country a couple of years ago. And it was a moving moment. And I know a lot of them still talk about it. It's one of those special places you need to go to. And you mentioned also the kind of the raw courage that this job is not supposed to require. To be honest, I mean, I often, the job of an election official, even a secretary of state, is supposed to be relatively boring. There's never a headline on the Wednesday after an election that everything went great. You never get that pat on the back, a simple thank you, Brian. You don't even get that, right? You get, you're really only noticed if you're Catherine Harris in Florida and something went horribly wrong on the Wednesday after the election day, right? That's something, I know the name Teresa Lepore, And I couldn't name any other county election officials in Florida from 2000, but I know Teresa Lepore's name because she was in Palm Beach County. And it strikes me that as we talk about the sincerely disappointed and targeted and lied to supporters of the losing presidential candidate, who I think all of us have sympathy for. Being invested in an election and having your candidate lose is hard. There's hardly anyone in the United States in the last 6 years hasn't had that experience, and that can be difficult. But Bill, you were talking when you get to the point where your high school friends are starting to look at you as the enemy and starting to rationalize some pretty despicable behavior, the challenges that you face. And I'm also wondering, not just if you can elaborate a little bit more on what you and your fellow supervisors and the recorder have faced, but also your staffs in both offices, and the fact that you've been, how you've been able to keep them working and keep their morale up, even as many of them are identified. Some of them get doxxed online, some of them get threatened. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so as far as that's concerned, David, I'm in a unique position, right? Because I'm a Republican. I'm a lifelong Republican. I started the teenage Republican group at my high school. I actually did election integrity work for the Republican Party for years. Ironically, in 2008, when John McCain was our party's nominee, I ran the election day operation for the Arizona Republican Party. But you would never know that from the way that, the Arizona Republican Party talks about me, the Maricopa County Republican Party talks about me and my colleagues. But as I explain to people, especially when I'm talking to business people, I say, look, this isn't a partisan issue at all. This is a leadership issue. And these are employees who we're essentially the board of directors for Maricopa County. And we're supporting our workers. We're supporting their efforts. If they had done something wrong, we would be the first ones to address that and own up for it. But that's not what happened. As everyone has said here, it was an outstanding election that was run in 2020 in Maricopa County. So we're standing up for their work. And I think humbly, that may be part of why we've been able to keep this team together, because they've seen us. They've seen Stephen Richer, our new recorder. And just for those who don't know Stephen Richer, as David mentioned, he beat Adrian Fontes, the Democrat recorder, in 2020. Stephen Richer's fingerprints are not on the 2020 election at all. He could, as a politician, say, you know what, I wasn't involved in 2020. Hey, there's questions, but you know what, I'm going to run a better election in 2022, working with the Board of Supervisors. But that's not what he's done. In fact, he's run into the building, okay? He has run into the building. He has stood up for his workers time and time again. I mean, for me, this was the election that I helped oversee, okay? So I'm a little biased, I'll admit it. Stephen is not. That is remarkable. I mean, you want to talk about profiles in courage. But, as time has gone on, more and more of my story, of our story, we've been able to put the pieces together. And it's chilling. I think we all know about the Eastman memo, right? We all know about the discussions that took place literally of using the military to seize election machines. Unfortunately, thank God, that didn't happen. But instead, they decided to go and seize election machines in another way. Fortunately, it wasn't successful in most of the country, but it was successful in Arizona because of Karen Fann and Warren Peterson, two members of the Arizona State Senate that sent subpoenas to the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, demanding that we turn over the election machines and the ballots. We all know that turned into the Arizona audit, the now infamous Arizona audit. So the Eastman memo lived on in some way. Unfortunately, we had people here in Arizona that allowed that to happen. And I want everyone to understand, we went to court as a Board of Supervisors to find out whether we could legally turn over those things. We believe that we did not have that legal authority to do so. But when a court said that we could turn them over, that those were valid subpoenas, we turned them over. I'm really tired of all these Republicans in Arizona saying we've obstructed. We have not obstructed. We have stood up for our voters and we followed the law. We respected the decision of the court. But I'll tell you about a couple things that happened. Number one, January 6th. January 6th, I was watching TV at home. I was working from home that day. And I saw what was going on January 6th. I was very quickly in contact with people here in Arizona who said, Bill, you need to get out of your house. So that evening I spent in an Airbnb with my family. We watched from the US Senate, the deliberations once they reconvened from an Airbnb. But again, we went to court. We were looking for direction. We explained that to Karen Fann. But what did Karen Fann do? She went and got a resolution from all the Republicans in the Arizona Senate to hold us in contempt. Hold us in contempt, which would have given the Senate president authority, several things, including the authority to detain us, to jail us. Fortunately, Paul Boyer, one Republican senator, stood against this, and he voted against contempt. So we were one vote away from something that a lot of people say they want to see us do all the time here, which is a perp walk. Again, another thing that we hear on a daily basis. And that evening, we were very concerned that people would take this into our own hands, take it into their own hands, and come to our houses and arrest us. There were guillotines set up on the lawn of the Arizona legislature for us, the Board of Supervisors. One of the sort of quiet political offices in Arizona that no one had ever paid attention to before. And finally, my colleague Clint Hickman, when he was chair back in 2020, he had a similar experience to Secretary Benson. He had 90 people outside of his house on a Sunday night, chanting, all sorts of things, just awful. And he called me, I was picking up dinner with my daughter, and he said, hey, Bill, they're on their way. They're on their way. They never came, but that's what we're dealing with. And people, and here's my final thing, sorry to keep going on. This is my biggest frustration, is my fellow Republicans. My fellow Republicans who refuse to speak out against this. They've had so many opportunities. Now, I was pleased to see that yesterday, we had several Republicans in the Arizona State Senate who actually voted along with all the Democrats to censure Wendy Rogers, Arizona State Senator, who is one of the biggest spreaders of election misinformation. In fact, just earlier this week, she sent out a tweet that said that the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors is a bunch of Soros puppets. Soros puppets, who are 4 out of 5 of us are Republicans. And yet these are friends. These Republican leaders who we have worked for, pounded signs into the ground for, never spoken up in our defense. That's why we are where we are. Until the leaders of the Republican Party stand up and say enough is enough, we will continue to be in the situation that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, I am constantly struck as I talk to folks around the country at the lack of courage from so many, which makes the courage when people do stand up stand out all the more. We've seen a few instances of it in Arizona, too few, but a few instances of it, including you, Bill. A few instances in Michigan, of course. I think Senator Ed McBroom has been a truth teller, which is really important. Of course, I mean, we have to discuss the role of someone like a Liz Cheney, who, you know, we have to be able to disagree on policy, but agree to the value of the guardrails we erect around American democracy. And she certainly is a great example of that. And I'm struck also, Bill, by, you know, you say you had to defend the election. You didn't have to defend the election. It would have been easy for you to try to backtrack or something like that, but you did not do that. And I think the fact that Adrian Fontes, the former Democratic recorder, and Stephen Richer, the current Republican recorder, who probably don't agree on much of policy, they do agree on the integrity of Maricopa County elections. And Adrian stood up for the integrity of an election he lost, and Stephen stood up for the integrity of an election that he had nothing to do with. And I think that's really remarkable. Similarly, Brian, in Florida, I know from talking to you, you and your colleagues, your staffs have faced a lot of these same threats, have had to stand up against lies being perpetrated by extremists, in some cases by con artists, in some cases by members of your legislature. Can you talk a little bit about what you've been through?
Sure. Let me just piggyback off of something Bill said. You know, we may come from different parties, but you know, when I give speeches, one of the things I always like to do is I'll ask the audience, does anyone know if I'm a Republican or Democrat? You know my political persuasion. And I'm pleased to say they've never outed me, if you will. And that's a good thing. I tell them that you shouldn't know. But it's public record. I'm a lifelong Republican. I'm a Reagan Republican. I registered when I'm proud to be a Reagan Republican for my personal views and how I vote. How we run our offices obviously are nonpartisan. It's like election day never ended in 2020. You know, I think back to 2016, and you know, we know with Russia's interference. Speaking of Putin, you know, one of the two of the three goals were to erode voter confidence and also have polarized voters. And here we are. And I never thought in a million years we would go from battling Putin and Russia in 2016 to our own countrywomen, our own political leaders that have to know when they look in the mirror and they put their head on the pillow, they know they're not being truthful with the American public. They have to know that. And how can they sleep at night? It's disgusting. You know, I think back to after 2016, we were all hyper fixated as well. We should be on a cyber posture. We've all done a great job with that. But I remember being in meetings, raising my hand saying, what about this huge vehicle that is misinformation on social media? And it's never adequately been addressed, to be honest with you. I've lost some friends as well. No high school friends, still did, but lost some friends who were not happy with the statement I issued back in December 2020. So to go back before that, you know, it's so easy to play Monday morning quarterback with, you know, what about all the states that were just pushing vote by mail? We were, myself included. There was a thing called a pandemic that we're still going through. We want to make sure people could vote. It's not really a nefarious agenda. What started out for me was we did a notice to all voters in my jurisdiction. We have about 400,000 who did not have a request for absentee ballot or vote by mail on file to encourage. And we simply said, because of the unknown, we may not have poll workers enough to run the election in November. This is back in April of 2020. We may not have enough polling places. So consider it as an option. And I was clear to underline option, made it like larger font and bolded it. And for that, I got some love voicemails and emails calling me, I was a rhino, part of the deep state, reference a lot of Speaker Pelosi and others, all for encouraging individuals to consider it as an option. As you mentioned, David, we a flurry of options for Florida voters. You can vote by mail, you can vote in person early, of course, on election day. And so as we went into the fall, I didn't discuss it publicly, but you know, I received some vague threats. Nothing, my God, nothing compared to Secretary Benson or Chairman Gates. But you know, we have a call center. One of my staff kind of managed that function for us, and she was called racial slur probably 30, 40 times, other inappropriate things you would not say to a woman, was threatened to be shot, threatened to be beaten. And we didn't discuss this. We worked with local law enforcement, and you know, it was kind of kept under wraps. And then the day after the election, I'll never forget this, because you know, it was, Florida's always close, as we know, and it wasn't even close in Florida. It was pretty known before about 8:30 which way it was going to go. And you know, our concern is election day prayer is, dear God, let the winners win big by at least 0.51% in Florida, of course, to avoid a recount. But with that said, the next day, I started getting emails and constituent outreach. It was the same verbatim script. I'm a Republican. You made me use a Sharpie pen. How do I know my vote counted? And after the 30th one, my executive assistant did a little research, and we found out that was the birth of the post-election day conspiracy going back to Maricopa County. We know it was debunked. We know it was false. And what was fascinating to me was I had my colleagues in Florida, a lot of outreach, and yet these voters were in Florida where it wasn't close, but they want to be part of the not larger narrative of what they perceive had happened. And so I saw it play out, threats against my colleagues here on the panel and others in other states. And you know, as you said earlier, the election community is pretty narrow. You know, we go to these events and it's a pretty close group of people, and I know them, but I don't know what political persuasion are, nor do I care, and vice versa, because it's about running elections professionally. So to see the threats that my colleagues went through and others, it bothered me and bothered me and bothered me. And then for me, the final straw was when I saw Gabe Sterling of Georgia give that impassioned plea on December 1st. That just resonated with me. I confess I went home that night, thought about it, and I had some of my friends and colleagues in Florida who said, you really shouldn't speak about that because that's not Florida, other states. And I won't tell you what I said in response, but it was a little Irish temper may have come out hypothetically, because it was just sticking up for our brothers and sisters and our profession. So I spoke out the next day, December 2nd, and issued a statement. And in the statement, it basically just said, by all accounts, the election is over. President-elect Biden is going to be sworn in January 20th, and it called for unity. In fact, I even in my statement referenced 9/11, that horrible day. But like most things in America, there's always a bright spot in tragedy. I think back to that day. If you recall, that night, men and women of Congress, didn't matter what party they were, what gender, what race, they held hands and sang "God Bless America" to show the world we were united. And now we couldn't be any more polarized. And so because of that statement, I had several hundred not so flattering emails and voicemails. Protesters showed up in my office, which I told them I wasn't going to be there, and that was their First Amendment right, certainly. But they came in looking for me, and then they said to one of my staff, "We're going to go to where he lives." Where they thought I lived ended up being the ex-Mrs. Corley's house with my son, who lives there, who was a minor at the time. And they were just blaring music and just being generally disruptive. Then they were going to where I lived at the time, I was made aware of some threats that involved even death threats. I never saw the threats, but I was made aware of them. And so it's a strange feeling. Again, I can't imagine what's like Secretary Benson went through with her daughter at their house. It's a strange feeling knowing that there's someone who could be out to hurt you. I never thought in a million years I'd have to deal with the FBI and local law enforcement. And that was in December 2020, and it's like it never ended. It's even just yesterday, I'm getting emails from individuals wanting to get information in relation to the November 2020 election. And it frustrates me is I had a constituent call me one time. This is something that really stuck with me. The individual said to me was basically contesting the facts, all the debunked conspiracy theories as we know they are. But I finally said to him, and I was being tongue in cheek, trying to kind of bring it down a bit. And I told the individual, I said, if I were to, if I try and educate you on the facts with my training and experience, education, you will, if it doesn't subscribe to your existing viewpoint of what you've seen on social media or what you're watching on a certain 24-hour cable news channel, then it's dismissive as fake news. But if I were to yield reality and truth as I know it to be and say, okay, you're right, election was rigged or stolen or whatever. And I said to the individual, I said, then you would call me a patriot. Again, being tongue in cheek. And the person said, that's exactly, you would be a patriot. And that's a troubling sign for our future, quite honestly, when we can't rise above politics and partisan politics for truth and reality. And so, it's to bring it back full circle. It's sad to me to think what's become of our profession. I mean, I just don't know, who would want to do this job going forward. You always think about the future, who's going to take the baton next. And, you mentioned earlier, David, I fell into this. I was one of those hacks that sort of fell into it in 2007 and fell in love with it immediately. And it's just really, it's frustrating to see us being disparaged just for doing our jobs.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to go to questions in a second here, but it strikes me that, we've talked a lot about the threats. We've talked some about harassment. We've talked a little bit about the criminalization and the threats of prosecution. Bill, you've seen it in Arizona. In Florida, there have been laws passed that add criminal penalties inflicted on supervisors of elections and election officials for perceived malfeasance. In Wisconsin, we're seeing election officials literally being threatened with arrest for having done their jobs admirably because people are upset about the results. I mean, it's one of the reasons we started the Election Official Legal Defense Network to provide defense. We've actually had to provide, in at least one case so far, a criminal defense lawyer to an election official who was being threatened with prosecution. I get asked by the press sometimes, is this the worst you've ever seen it? And I said, no, we've never seen this. This is not the worst. This wasn't before. The idea of coordinated massive threats, harassment, criminal prosecutions being aimed at our civil servants who run elections, who facilitate our democracy, who call it like they see it, who call balls and strikes. That is something we have never seen in American history since the establishment of our democracy. This gets a little bit to the point. One member of the audience asked, what's the future of mitigating the spread of some of these conspiracy theories and the cyber influence that kind of lead people down this path and reinforce their pre-existing beliefs that, oh, I liked my candidate, how could he possibly have lost? This is a good point. Usually the best conspiracy theories and cyber influence campaigns have a thread of truth, which makes countering them extremely difficult. And I think one of the best examples of this, just before, Brian, you were mentioning mail voting. In most states, mail voting, the opportunities for mail voting were basically the same as they've always been. Or if they were changed, they had been changed well in advance. For instance, in Pennsylvania, they were allowing mail voting for the first time because the Republican legislature in 2019, pre-COVID, passed the mail voting law in Pennsylvania. Normally mail ballots don't necessarily skew one way or the other. If they do, and Bill, I think you know this from Arizona, they tend to be used more by white voters, by older voters, and by property owners because they use the mail a little bit more. They tend to be a little more less mobile. And many Republicans, especially campaign operatives I've talked to, view them as more likely to be Republican voters. But in 2020, that changed, and it changed for one reason and one reason only. And that was the losing presidential candidate told his own voters not to use mail ballots. And so when those mail ballots were being counted, they were disproportionately Democratic because Republican voters voted in another way. So that's kind of one of those shred of truth things that it is true that mail ballots skewed to Democrats, but there's a very easy explanation for why that is in this particular election. Jocelyn, I'll start with you. Do you have any thoughts about how to mitigate some of this disinformation that's pervading the space and bring people back to reality?
Yeah, I think, first, I think, as you were just demonstrating, the facts and data speak for themselves. And they're, there and all of our commitment to transparently providing those facts and data is, I think, our responsibility, but also, something that we've really stepped up and done. I mean, we really revamped our entire elections website at the Department of State to be a resource for people looking for facts and data about how many people voted absentee, what were the results of this or that election, or how many ballots were rejected and why. So I think, us as election administrators being, proud of the fact that truth is on the side of democracy and on our side of as election administrators, and then sharing that truth, and then in positioning ourselves as many have as trusted sources for that information, working with other trusted messengers in communities, and really encouraging every citizen not just to think critically, but to be the truth tellers, as many leaders, not enough, but many leaders have chosen to be, the many that we were talking about earlier. And then secondly, I think the other thing that's important to keep talking about is, what's the goal of these lies? What's the goal? I mean, part of it is, individuals trying to become famous, run for office, or raise money off of these lies and conspiracy theories. But there's also a deep and more rooted goal, an overarching goal of that actually connects the work of foreign adversaries to create chaos and cause citizens to doubt our elections and ultimately disengage. I mean, truly proponents of the big lie are essentially doing the work of our foreign adversaries for them by instead of now needing to or trying to hack our elections to make our citizens doubt our elections. There are countless individuals just spreading these lies to create the same impact, hacking voters' minds, as we have typically said in these conversations, to again cause enough confusion and chaos that they either convince citizens not to vote or can then overturn the results of legitimate elections they don't win. And there's been so much chatter and delegitimizing of elections in general, citizens are more apt to accept election subversion than they otherwise might. So there's really deep, nefarious, anti-democratic, un-American goals to this misinformation, and really talking about that big picture and empowering citizens to counter it with the facts and the truth is to me the antidote to all of it. And I'll just, again, close by emphasizing the connection of all this to election funding. As election administrators, we use funding, whether it's federal funding, which we've consistently asked for, or state funding to build the election infrastructure that's safe and secure and accessible to all. We also use funding to educate voters. So that, and what we've done in Michigan, for example, is when we educate voters ahead of time about, let's say, how to vote from home or vote by mail, when misinformation then seeps into their communities about their right to vote by mail or from home, that misinformation doesn't land because voters have already been educated with the truth and they know where to find more data if they need to. So that's the work we all really need to do, invest in our elections so that we can educate voters and really all together work to be critical thinkers and truth tellers. And again, to me, that's the path out of this. It's a path that's available for all of us to take. We've just got to be willing to do the hard work that it requires.
Yeah, it strikes me, you and I have talked about this, and I think all three of us have talked with each other about this, four of us. When the cyber ninjas do what they do, when leaders in Arizona refuse to speak the truth to their own voters, or in Florida or Michigan, or when we see what happens in Wisconsin, even just recently yesterday, with a massive disinformation campaign about the election, autocrats in Moscow and Beijing and Tehran just sit back and say, pass the popcorn. I mean, that is doing the work. They want us to be preoccupied with our division and our disinformation and these lies, because that will leave a vacuum on the world stage that they can then fill. And every national security expert will tell you that, every disinformation expert will tell you that. And the only difference right now is, rather than having to put in the hard work that they've always put in to spread disinformation, create the content through our social media platforms, they're now just sitting back and watching domestic actors do it to ourselves. We're doing it, we're delegitimizing our own democracy for free. Bill and Brian, do you have any thoughts on kind of how to mitigate the effects of some of this disinformation campaigns that we're seeing?
Well, David, when I became chair of the board in January, I gave my chairman's address, and that's what I said. I said this was a very well-run election in 2020, but we're going to make the 2022 election the most transparent in our history. And it's a big election, I think, as probably everybody on this call knows. Not only are all of our statewide races up, many of these open seats, but we also may have the U.S. Senate, control the U.S. Senate hanging in the balance with the Mark Kelly race. But here's the thing. I think you raise a very good point as it relates to mail-in voting. Again, this has historically, I put my Republican hat on here. Historically, this has been a real advantage for Republicans. We have succeeded at this over the years. Now, in just a 2-year period, this has flipped. And in fact, just this week, the Arizona Republican Party filed a lawsuit with the Arizona Supreme Court asking that early voting be declared unconstitutional. I mean, it's just unbelievable. As I've said many times on this, one, I'm very proud of the fact that I think we have the most robust hybrid voting system in the country. If you want to vote by mail, you can vote by mail. If you want to vote early in person, you can vote early in person. And if you want to vote on election day, my colleagues and I are committed that you're going to be able to continue to do that. So we want to give all these options to people, but instead to essentially put this genie back in the bottle and say you can't vote by mail anymore. I think your legal theory is wrong, but I also think it's bad politics for the Republican Party.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's also, I think most people who run elections in states where basically it's as easy to vote through 3 different methods as it is in your states. Early in person, by mail, or on election day in person. Election officials will tell you that spreading voting out over those 3 different modes over multiple days is an integrity measure. It's a security measure. If you have a malfunction, if you have a cyber attack, if you have attempted fraud, your odds of identifying that because of different modes where the other 2 modes are a control, because of advance notice, early voting. I mean, if you have a problem with your voter database, you want to know it a week or 2 before. You don't want to learn about it at 2 p.m. on election day. And so if you care about election integrity, you want voters to be able to exercise their choice and spread voting out. It also makes it a lot easier, as you know, early in mail voting in states, maybe not so much in Michigan. We didn't really get to this. Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, the laws have not quite caught up to where they need to be with regard to pre-processing of ballots, but it enables you to get your results out so much earlier. I mean, the fact that Florida was called at 8:30 is a testament to the laws in place, the procedures you put in place, and the hard work of your of the election officials throughout the state. Brian, do you have any thoughts on the disinformation point?
Yeah, how do we do it? You know, one voter at a time. I'm eternally optimistic. I think that Secretary Vance spoke about this. You know, educating voters, having information on your website as a resource. We've worked hard on that to educate individuals about what we're doing, and of course outreach. One of my colleagues in Florida had a great idea. He had a basically election open house. In about an hour and a half, he walked you through A to Z, to include our public logic and accuracy test, how we canvass our vote by mail, how the results are transmitted, and it was very, very well received. And so, you know, having that sort of outreach is huge. Transparency, you know, we encourage people. We love for people to come out and see what we do when these are publicly available meetings. And my hope is, and I've seen some of this, some of my colleagues who've had municipal elections have had some of these activist groups show up. And not all of them, but when they left, they seem to understand, have a little bit more comfort. And I hope that's the case. My only concern is that, you know, sometimes we have, you know, basically, you know, when you're dealing with constituents, it seems to be more confirmation bias. And case in point is there was a document going around, and, you know, to my colleagues here in Florida who said, you know, oh, those other states dealing with those issues. Well, that came back hard at Florida because there was a document that was published by someone who shall remain nameless, who's in sales, that alleged that votes were flipped, even though President Trump handily won in 2020. And it even had IP addresses to show that voting machines were hacked. The only problem with that is every one of those IP addresses were simply someone visiting that respective county's website, like they are right now in our states. When you explain that to a constituent, again, it's confirmation bias. They don't like that because it doesn't subscribe to their existing viewpoint. But we have to continue that outreach and education model to try and dispel those myths and urban legends.
Yeah, that's a great point, Brian. And I you know, one of the things that really strikes me as well, and this relates to the disinformation question. This will probably be the last question we have a chance to get to. We've seen a lot of the moving of the goalposts. When you don't have a coherent story, you constantly move the goalposts with your stories. You know, first, the voting machines were hacked. Well, we actually have paper ballots in all of the battleground states, and we could actually look at them, and they were audited and they were recounted. So that's not true. But there must have been a server in Italy that magically changed all of the ballots. Well, that server doesn't exist, and that's a fantasy. You know, the paper ballots were made out of bamboo or fed to chickens. That's been debunked. The illegal voters voted, and every time that's been looked at, there's a couple of instances where that might have happened, but it's, you know, I think Brad Raffensperger in Michigan found 2 dead people, both of whom were spouses of a living voter, and their spouse cast their ballot for them, hardly a coordinated effort. And some of the latest have been the attacks on the so-called Zuckerberg money, which all 3 of your states took some. My organization distributed some. It was offered to every single state. Every single state got exactly what they asked for and had to account for it. It was used for nonpartisan voter education in every single case. But there's some, you know, there's an effort to try to make it seem as something other than it was, while at the same time not fully funding election offices. And lastly, there's been attacking on the Electronic Registration Information Center, which is something all 3 of your states and 27 or 8 other states use to keep their voter lists accurate and actually remove dead people from the lists and actually remove people who've moved out of your states off the list. And one of the themes I'm seeing is that the election deniers are cloaking themselves in under the pretext of election integrity to actually dismantle the election integrity infrastructure. And I don't know if you all agree with that, and I'd love to get your thoughts on just that idea in general, because we're actually under the auspices of election integrity. A lot of the bills you're seeing promoted in your state, a lot of the rhetoric that's being used by election deniers actually destroys election integrity, diminishes election integrity. Do any of you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say you're exactly right. I mean, the irony is that the misinformation and what people are, calling out is, if it was actually responded to, would actually harm the security of our elections. And so to do all of that under the banner of election integrity and security is, horrendously hypocritical. To anyone, lawmakers or otherwise who sincerely want to protect the security or advance the security of our elections, I and other election officials, including all of us here, I'm sure have a laundry list of things they can actually do. And it starts with fully funding our elections and supporting our election administrators, protecting us from the threats that we are receiving as a result of this misinformation. And so it's particularly frustrating when you see all this misinformation geared at trying to stop or deter election officials from doing exactly what we need to do to secure our democracy, and then a complete neglect of the list of things that actually needs to be happen if people let lawmakers and otherwise want to be partners in protecting the security and election and integrity of our elections. Actually working with us to identify what truly can happen and what we can do is the solution. And yet, instead of seeking that solution, so many often choose instead to simply just attack and spread misinformation.
Yeah, Bill or Brian, do you have any additional thoughts?
Just one thing on that vein is, a lot of people have said we're opposed to audits in Maricopa County. That's simply not true. We support audits. Everyone on this call knows the sort of audits that are already provided for under law. What I'm opposed to are extra legal audits. And that's what the Arizona audit was. I didn't say illegal, but it was extra legal. There were no statutes that set forth how that was supposed to occur. And that's one of the reasons it was such a mess. They literally made it up as it went along. So I'm supportive of additional audits, post-election audits that don't get in the way of certifying an election, but a post-election audit done by experts, done by folks who are impartial, to the extent that that can help with transparency, can help build faith, rebuild faith. I support that, but not something like what the Cyber Ninjas did. Something like that should never happen again.
Brian, any last thoughts before I wrap up?
I can't top my two colleagues on the panel. What they said. How's that?
That's great. On my behalf, I'd like to thank the three of you, and especially Paul, you and the McCain Institute for hosting this. And if I could channel Bill for a second, I mean, we'd all probably have been better off if everyone would just ask themselves, WWJMD, what would John McCain do? Because I don't think there's any question as to how he would have responded to this controversy, and hopefully we'll be able to rebuild that spirit.
Yes, David, as Brian said, I really can't beat that. But I wanted to thank each of you, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, Chairman Bill Gates, and Supervisor Brian Corley, for all your thoughts and participating today. We're honored to have you, and thank you to our audience for tuning in to this important topic, because it affects all of us. It affects our democracy. So I really appreciate all of you for standing up for a cause greater than yourselves. I think we are indebted to all of you and to the election workers and election around this country who safeguard our elections and make them safe. So thank you again for joining us today, and we hope you join us again for our next round of conversations. Thanks again. Bye.